Hello, it's time for Culture Hash. This week we're going to talk about the debut album from South London rapper Dave. Dave, formerly known as Santan Dave, is only 20 years old but has already built himself quite a large reputation within the hip-hop and mainstream music circles. Dave has already released 2 critically acclaimed EPs. He managed to debut at #1 with the track Funky Friday featuring Fredo. This was a straight British hip-hop track. It didn't have any bells and whistles or any pop sensibilities or a sexy hook. It was just the 2 rappers just exchanging bars for a few minutes. And it managed to debut at #1, beating Calvin Harris and Sam Smith. Quite an achievement for any UK hip-hop artists. And it shows the mainstream appeal that Dave already has, that he doesn't have to switch up his sound to achieve mainstream chart success. Funky Friday came out in late 2018, but let's go back a little bit further to get a bit more background on Dave. So, the artist formerly known as Santan Dave officially broke out in 2016 with the track Thiago Silva, which featured AJ Tracey. This track went gold, and like Funky Friday, it just heard the 2 rappers just exchanging bars over quite a nice, smooth grime track. Dave followed this up with a very successful solo single, Wanna Know. Like Thiago Silva, this track received silver certification in the UK singles charts, and it took only 5 weeks before Drake released an official remix of the track, helping Dave's career massively blow up. The success of these 2 singles helped Dave achieve a degree of mainstream success outside of the UK hip-hop scene and its hardcore fan base. In 2017, Dave teamed up with J Hus for the track Samantha. At this time, both were buzzing in the UK hip-hop scene, and this was a nice collaboration between the 2 rappers. This track actually went gold, despite only peaking at number 63 in the UK singles chart, so it was very much helped by the streaming success that Dave was already generating early in his career. To capitalise on this string of successful singles, Dave released the much anticipated EP Game Over in November 2017. This project peaked at number 13 in the UK album chart, and from this point we really saw Dave just achieve a lot more mainstream attention than he had previously. Game Over was a really consistent, nice project from Dave, and he showed a lot more depth to his character than we'd previously heard from him. And while Game Over had some fun tracks like the platinum-selling No Words featuring Mostak, Dave earned critical acclaim from Game Over with a trifecta of hard-hitting, emotionally raw tracks that spanned over 5 minutes long each. It was these tracks that were central to Dave's newfound mainstream critical success. There were tracks like Question Time, which was over 7 minutes long and saw Dave just rage against the government. He criticised all the mainstream political parties, the lack of real conclusion to the Grenfell inquiry, and questioned the hypocritical nature of being black in the UK and feeling victimised by the government and the police. Question Time was a massive success for Dave. It went viral and it earned him one of those Ivor Novello prize things that everyone seems to be really interested in. How I Met My Ex was another critically acclaimed moment from Game Over. Like Question Time, How I Met My Ex was notable for Dave's laser focus on the subject matter of How I Met My Ex. He details meeting his ex-girlfriend, his insecurities in their relationship, his own trust issues, and he really accepts a lot of blame for the breakdown of this relationship. Dave's maturity and brutally honest self-critical take in this track makes it extremely compelling and is another standout moment from Game Over. My 19th birthday is the closer on this album. It goes to over 8 minutes long. This one lacks the focus of Question Time and How I Met My Ex, but it finds Dave just really evaluating his life at the age of 19. And despite lacking the sharp focus of the previous long tracks, My 19th Birthday really shows Dave as just a sharp lyricist who is really aware of his own self and his own environment around him. And again, makes for a really gripping track and a nice way to close out the Game Over EP. This was a really enjoyable project from Dave, and it's been 2 years since we've last heard him release an extended project and collection of songs like this. Since the release of Game Over, Dave has been fairly quiet. He's only put out 2 lead singles by himself, the aforementioned Funky Friday and Hangman. He was also featured on the Last Gigs mixtape as well. And I get the impression that Dave has just been focusing on his debut album, which we've finally been graced with. Psychodrama is here, the debut album from Dave. Let's get into it. Psychodrama sees Dave take the formula that worked so successfully on Game Over and spread it across the 11 tracks of his debut album. It makes for a compelling listen, and there's a lot of continuation with what we've heard on Game Over. Firstly, the production is largely unchanged. Fraser T. Smith executive produced this album along with Dave, and both artists have production credits on every single track on this album. Fraser T. Smith, known for working with the likes of Adele and Stormzy and Craig David over the years. Fraser T. Smith is a man who's got real cachet within the British hip-hop scene, as well as the broader UK scene as well. As we know, Dave is grade 7 at piano, and a lot of his tracks are piano-based, and it gives a nice level of continuity with the previous Dave tracks that we've heard before. We've also got the obligatory production feature from J5, who produces Location, featuring Burna Boy. As you'd expect, this is one of the more bouncy and fun moments on Psychodrama, but it still fits in within this concept that Dave has loosely defined throughout. Psychodrama is loosely defined as a concept album. It's built around these fictional therapy scenes that Dave has with a therapist, naturally. This idea of therapy came to Dave when he spoke to one of his brothers who's in prison, who's also been going through therapy, and this inspired the album's loose theme. And throughout the album, there's a few moments where the therapist asks Dave questions, and these usually lead into the next track and define the theme of the following track. So we've got this strata of therapy that unites the album into this theme. And on top of this, Dave adds a 3-act structure to this project to add even more layers to Psychodrama. So we've got these two levels of concept album throughout Psychodrama, but they work quite cohesively together and don't really conflict and compete with the message that Dave is trying to convey to the audience. So Act 1 is environment. This is where Dave talks about where he's from. It includes tracks like Streatham, where Dave talks about where he grew up in South London. I love the hook on this track. Dave's got some great wordplay. The hook is based around this double meaning where Dave's saying that while he's at school getting tests, people on the street are going out, giving out testers of drugs. So we've got some good wordplay from Dave here, and generally his level of rap is just much improved from when I last heard him. I was always impressed by Dave's technical ability as a rapper, but on Psychodrama, it feels like he's pushed this level even higher, and he's got some great bars, some really brilliant wordplay throughout this. It feels like every track he's just got a great line that just comes out and just brightens up the track and just adds some levity, or makes you think about what's going on in his world as well. Just some great wordplay throughout this. I feel like he's really just worked on his craft and is much improved. The opening track, Psycho, really bookends this album nicely with the closer, Drama. Together, obviously, Psychodrama, the title of the album. Psycho opens with a monologue from the therapist dating their session as January 2018, when Dave started working on the album. And Psycho just hears Dave just really just talk about what he's going through. He really goes into his past. He talks about suicidal thoughts that he's had, growing up without a father, being exposed to violence on the street at a very tender age, and how this has really affected his psychology and his emotion as a 20-year-old man. It feels like he's still carrying this past around with him, and he really just opens up emotionally and gives the audience a real sense of who Dave is, the person. Like I said when I reviewed the Bugsy Malone album, it's really positive to hear some of these black male role models discussing their mental health in a really mature and open way, and really just laying it out there and letting people know that it's okay to talk about these negative feelings. And Dave also addresses some suicidal thoughts that he's experienced in the past, making it quite a bleak opener, but also a very powerful and impactful way to begin Psychodrama. Act 1 also includes the controversial lead single Black, where Dave talks about the experience of being a young black male in the UK, talking about this lack of heritage that a lot of people feel, the institutional racism a lot of people come up against. He also throws out one of the most profound lines throughout the entire of Psychodrama: the blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice. A kid dies, the blacker the killer, the sweeter the news. It's these passionate, fiery, insightful and true lyrics from Dave that has caused this controversy over the single Black. as some listeners to Radio 1 actually called in to complain about the provocative nature of this track. Dave was just speaking his truth, growing up as a black man in Britain. It's not all going to be rosy and like the Desmonds. These are things that people aren't talking about in the UK, and people like Dave are really putting it out there in a really provocative and thought-provoking way with some real maturity. And I feel like the situation that Dave is talking about should be more controversial than the actual fact that he put a song out that made people feel uncomfortable about race. Act 2, Relationships, features tracks like Purple Heart, which is a bit of a sexy love song. Dave talks about sex in quite a graphic way. Dave says the line, "You'll give me head till your head aches." And maybe it's just me, but I feel like he sort of delivered quite a crass line in a way that doesn't sound as sleazy as it actually is. Maybe that's just me, but I find that quite amusing. Purple Heart is like a standard like rap love song really. It's alright. Purple Heart's also got quite a nice flowetry sample that's been chopped and buried quite deep within the production. You have to listen quite closely to hear it. Purple Heart is probably one of the best produced tracks on this album actually, but the subject matter is a bit, we've heard it all before really. It's okay. I much prefer Location featuring Burna Boy. Quite an underrated boppy track here. Burna Boy's got quite a nice little outro here. The production drops out quite nicely and then fades slowly back in as Burna Boy concludes the track and gives quite a nice little outro here. I love the track Disaster featuring J Hus. It's great to hear J Hus again. I mean, obviously he's in prison at the moment, so he's not putting stuff out, but having this track away in the locker is great for Dave to put out. As we've heard on Samantha from a couple of years ago, Dave and J Hus have got great chemistry together and they exchange some really clever bars here. They like reference people like JME. I like when J Hus says that he met Dave at the Santander. They've just got some really good wordplay here and they just flow really nicely into each other's verses. It's a nice British hip-hop track, quite inspired by grime, the way that the verses are quite long and just flow into and out of each other. J Hus has got some really menacing and dark bars here that he delivers in just his classic style, and Disaster is definitely another highlight of this album. So Act 3 is Social Compass, and it begins with the track Leslie. Leslie is an 11-minute examination of toxic masculinity, domestic abuse, emotional abuse, and just how life can go wrong if you meet the wrong people and have negative influences in your life. This is an 11-minute story track from Dave, similar to How I Met My Ex. The production is quite sparse and piano-led, as we've heard on some of these extended introspective tracks that Dave has released in the past. Leslie is the only track that goes over 5 minutes on this album, and Dave really explores this story and tells it in great detail. It's about a pregnant lady that Dave meets on his train, and he just details her life and just the negative relationship she's in, how this man that she's with is just ruining her life and just emotionally abusing her. And it's a very graphic and detailed examination of coercion and just emotional abuse and just these cycles that people go through. It's very emotionally raw and graphic and really just grips you as you just hear the story of Leslie that Dave just tells in such detail and with such emotion and heart. The production of this track is fantastic. There are some really somber strings that just fade in towards the end as the track becomes more dramatic and the story reaches a climax. There's a beautiful sung outro from American singer Ruel as well to close it out. And the somber nature of this outro just really makes you reflect on the story and just how many people like Leslie are just going around the world. And this somber outro really just heightens the emotion that Dave concludes the track with when he says that there are women all around the world that are just going from these really abusive relationships, and just asks you to consider the people that you meet in your day-to-day life and think about what might be affecting them on an emotional level. And after Dave delivers these lines about the Leslies being all around the world, there's a poignant moment of silence between that and the singing from Ruel, which really just makes you think about the story that Dave's just told you. Leslie really feeds into this therapy narrative that Dave's constructed around the album. It's introduced by the therapist who asked Dave about how fame has affected his connection with the ordinary people of the world. And Dave's emphasis on this emotional abuse experienced by Leslie really feeds into this theme of psychology and mental health that is prevalent throughout Psychodrama. Voices follows this track and is a bit more upbeat and poppy. On Voices, Dave does some rare singing on this album and just talks about trying to find just the self-love and acceptance of who you are and just being happy. This is a track with some really nice optimism and a great hook. I think it'd work well as a single. I really like Voices. Great track on here. And finally we get to the closer, Drama. This is another somber moment from Dave. It's introduced and closed by his brother who's in prison. On Drama, Dave really talks about the impact that his brothers and his family had on his life as a young man. Again, this is a really detailed and nuanced just portrait of Dave's psychology and who he is as a person. Another standout moment from this album as Dave showcases yet more emotional depth and just how his upbringing has affected how he is today. Dave talks about how his two brothers just had encounters with the law and one of them is in prison for life now. And we get a very touching and poignant outro from one of his brothers who phones from prison to tell Dave that he's proud of him. He recounts a story of when Dave was rapping when he was about 10. It's just a very touching closer to this album, just nice little outro where we just hear that Dave is loved and he's got acceptance from his family, and it just feels like it ends on a positive note despite the sad fact that the brother is still in prison. I love this album. Dave is showing maturity beyond his years. At 20 years old, he's put together a really emotionally raw and coherent project. Something I didn't like about Game Over is I felt there was a bit of filler, some of the songs for the ladies and a bit of the old misogyny on there. But Psychodrama is a lot more emotionally mature. There's some real raw moments on here, but there's also some great moments of introspection and hope. Dave's skills as a rapper have noticeably improved as well. He was always a good rapper, but I feel like he's taken a next step on this evolution here. He executes the themes well, there's a very strong coherence. These two concepts work quite nicely together, and I just love this whole album. I thought Dave has really pulled off a brilliant album here, and for me, 9 out of 10.